The wind howled through the heart of Lancaster, biting deep into the bones of the land. The old barn had collapsed under the weight of the season's first heavy snow, and Amos Byler was faced with a choice: hurry to build a new one, or take his time, trusting in the plan he'd been quietly working on for years. No one believed in his crazy idea, but when the coldest winter in a century swept in, Amos's shelter would become the only thing standing between his family and the frostbite threatening to overtake them all. Before we begin, share where you're watching from, and if tales of quiet courage, craftsmanship, and survival in the heart of winter speak to your spirit, join us for tomorrow's story. Amos Byler stood at the edge of his small farm, staring out over the fields where the remnants of his barn lay scattered beneath the fresh snowfall. He had spent the better part of 3 days hauling wood, stacking it with care, and measuring each beam twice before putting it in place. Yet as the snow began to fall heavier, a feeling of dread began to settle in his chest. His neighbors had warned him that such a barn wasn't practical, that he should be out there, rebuilding fast, just like the others in Lancaster. But Amos had never been one for speed. When it came to his family's survival, he knew that the quick route wasn't always the right one. It was the year 1888, and Lancaster had seen its share of hard winters. But this one felt different. The air was colder than it had ever been, and Amos had felt it in his bones, even before the first flakes began to fall. He had heard the whispers from his neighbors, the same neighbors who had once called him a fool for taking his time. "You're wasting daylight, Amos," they said. "Get it done now, or suffer later." But Amos had a different way of seeing things. His father had taught him that in the face of a storm it wasn't the fast and reckless who survived, but the patient, the careful, and the steady. And so, when the others rushed to rebuild their barns with hastily cut timbers, Amos had quietly drawn up plans for a winter shed. A shed that, though small, would be built to weather the fiercest winds and the deepest snows. Each piece of wood was carefully cut and shaped to fit exactly as it should. The walls were to be thick, double-layered, with sawdust packed in between for insulation. The roof would be reinforced with extra beams, each one carefully placed to support the weight of the snow. It was a slow, laborious process, but Amos had no doubt it would be worth it. He could already picture the warmth inside, the scent of his wife's baking bread mixing with the cedar smell of the walls. As night began to fall, Amos wiped the sweat from his brow and looked back over the land. The moon shone brightly on the horizon, but all around him the winds began to howl. He knew the storm would come soon, and when it did, the work he had done would have to speak for itself. The storm came swiftly, as Amos had expected. By the time the first light of dawn touched the snow-covered hills, the wind was howling like a beast, and the snow had already begun to pile high around the edges of the shed. Amos watched from his window, standing quietly by the fire as his children huddled close to their mother. His wife, Anna, had her hands folded in prayer as she quietly recited verses from the Bible, asking for strength. The storm outside was relentless, with winds gusting so fiercely that the trees bent beneath its weight. Amos turned his attention to the shed. The walls stood firm, the roof held steady, but the snow had already begun to drift heavily along the sides. He knew it was only a matter of time before the real test began. Anna looked up at him, her face pale from the cold. "Amos, do you think it will hold?" she asked softly, her voice tinged with concern. Amos didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked over to the window and peered through the frosted glass. He could see the neighboring farms, their barns standing empty, their roofs already sagging beneath the weight of the snow. The air seemed to grow heavier, thicker with the weight of the cold. But Amos knew his shed was different. He had built it for this moment. "I've done what I could, Anna," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "Now, we trust." Outside, the storm raged, but Amos didn't feel the familiar pang of fear that gripped his neighbors. He had taken his time, he had prepared, And so, as the snow continued to fall and the winds picked up, Amos turned to his family, offering a quiet smile. "We've done what's needed. We've built for the worst. Now let's wait." Days passed, and the storm only intensified. The blizzards raged for what felt like an eternity. By the time Amos ventured out to check on the shed, his breath hung in the air like smoke, and his hands were stiff with cold. The snowdrifts had buried much of the farm, but as Amos made his way to the shed, he was greeted by an unexpected sight. The roof was heavy with snow, yet it held firm. The walls, built of thick logs and packed with sawdust, stood resolutely, unaffected by the weight pressing against them. But Amos knew better than to be complacent. A structure could look sound from the outside, but the real test was in how it stood up to the unseen forces, how it endured when all seemed calm, only to be tested again when the storm's fury returned. He stepped inside, the door creaking slightly as he pushed it open. The warmth inside was a welcome relief from the freezing air outside. The fire in the stove crackled softly, the flames casting a golden glow on the wooden beams above. Amos couldn't help but smile, knowing that the effort he had put into every detail of this shed had paid off. The walls were holding strong. The insulation of sawdust between the layers of logs kept the interior warm and dry despite the blistering cold outside. He knelt by the stove and added more wood, letting the fire grow hotter. For a moment he simply sat there, his gaze flicking over the carefully constructed walls, the shelves of dried herbs and preserves, the stack of firewood neatly arranged for easy access. This was more than just a shelter. It was a sanctuary, built with patience, with care, and, most importantly, with foresight. Anna had been busy inside as well, making soup and baking bread to keep the family nourished during the long days. The children were huddled around the fire, their faces illuminated by the soft, flickering light. It was a picture of peace, one that Amos knew he had earned through his steady hands and quiet determination. But even in moments of peace, Amos was not free from the haunting realization that the worst was yet to come. He could hear the wind howling, shaking the walls, and the sound of ice crystals scraping against the window panes. The world outside had turned into a white, silent wilderness, and Amos knew that the snow was still falling, still piling higher and higher. His shed, though strong, would not be able to withstand this much longer. With a heavy heart, he turned to Anna. "The storm won't let up," he said, his voice steady, but tinged with the weight of what he knew was coming. "We'll need more supplies. I'll head out and check the barn tomorrow." Anna nodded, though she didn't say a word. She knew, as he did, that the real test of survival had just begun. The storm was not content to simply sweep through. It would settle in and force every family to endure. But for now, inside this small shed, Amos felt a sense of quiet gratitude. The worst of the storm might be ahead of them, but they were together, they were safe, and they had built something that could weather the storm, something that was theirs, made with their hands and their faith. The days stretched on, and Amos's resolve was tested more than once. The wind never seemed to stop, howling through the trees like an endless, mournful cry. Snow continued to fall in thick sheets, and the world outside became an unrecognizable landscape of white, frozen stillness. His neighbors, who had hastily rebuilt their barns, were now struggling to keep the cold from seeping into their homes. Amos had heard of families huddling together in their kitchens, burning through firewood faster than they could gather it. The ground was too frozen to dig for more, and the snow made it nearly impossible to even get to the nearest settlement. Amos, however, remained focused. He knew that this was the time his slow, steady work would show its worth. It was in the quiet moments of survival, when no one was watching, that the fruit of his labor would prove its value. The shed, despite the relentless storm, was still standing strong. It had become more than just a physical shelter. It was a symbol of his faith. Faith in the process, faith in the work, and faith in the God who had guided him through every decision. Amos knew that the simple, humble work of building of taking time, of not cutting corners, of trusting in divine providence, had prepared them for this moment. This was his test of faith, just as much as it was a test of his craftsmanship. He woke early one morning to the sound of Anna coughing, a dry, rasping cough that sent a chill through his heart. He had seen how the storm had taken its toll on the others, how families who had not prepared were already beginning to suffer. The cold crept into every corner, every crack, no matter how carefully sealed. He could not let this happen to his family. "I'll go out today," Amos said to Anna as she sat by the fire, still wrapped in her thick shawl. "We have enough food, but I'll gather some more firewood and check the root cellar. It'll be a hard day, but we can make it through." Anna looked at him, her eyes full of both worry and love. "Be careful, Amos," she said softly. "If the barn's already down, you can't afford to risk your life." Amos smiled at her and nodded, although in his heart he knew the risks. But the storm had taught him something. Survival was not just about battling the elements. It was about maintaining hope when the world seemed to be fading to white, about finding strength in the stillness and the quiet moments. With his coat buttoned tight against the wind, Amos stepped outside into the blizzard. The snow piled up quickly, each step a reminder of how much further they had to go. But even as he braved the storm, there was a small flame inside him, a hope that this quiet, careful way of living, built with patience, with love, and with faith, would see them through. Amos could feel the weight of the storm pressing against him as he made his way through the knee-deep snow toward the barn. The wind whipped through his coat, biting into the skin beneath. He had walked this land countless times, yet today the world seemed foreign, an endless expanse of white. His thoughts were consumed by the growing uncertainty. The barn had been a lifeline for the Byler family, and now, with its collapse, there was only the shelter of his winter shed, a modest refuge from the unforgiving elements. The days had blurred into one another, each more bitter than the last. But despite the storm's wrath, Amos's steadfastness had begun to show its strength. He had built with care, with faith, and with a quiet, unshakable belief that this shed would protect them, not just from the cold, but from the elements of the world that were so often unpredictable. As Amos neared the barn's remains, he could see the damage more clearly. The roof had caved in, and the walls had buckled under the weight of snow. It was gone, a casualty of the storm that had gripped Lancaster so fiercely. He stood for a moment, watching the destruction, and a feeling of loss washed over him. It wasn't just the barn that had been lost. It was the hurried, careless efforts of the past, the decisions that many had made without fully understanding the power of nature. The truth was, the storm wasn't merely a test of structures, it was a test of choices. And Amos had chosen differently. The shelter he'd built had stood firm, its walls strong and insulated, its roof untouched by the snow. It was not grand, not quick, but it had survived the worst winter anyone had ever known. It had survived because Amos had chosen patience, because he had built it to last, not just for today, but for the trials of tomorrow. Turning back toward the shed, Amos felt a quiet gratitude settle in his chest. He could see the smoke rising from the chimney, a beacon of warmth and safety. Inside, Anna and the children would be waiting, secure in the warmth of the fire he had tended so carefully, surrounded by the food and supplies that had been thoughtfully prepared. He knew that this was his victory, not one marked by loud triumph, but by the quiet peace of survival, by the ability to rest in the knowledge that he had done the right thing. By the time he returned to the shed, the sun was setting, casting a soft orange glow across the snow-covered fields. He opened the door, the familiar warmth enveloping him, and saw Anna's smiling face as she welcomed him back inside. "Well, how is it out there?" Anna asked, her voice warm with concern. "It's bad," Amos replied softly, taking off his heavy coat and gloves. "The barn is gone, but we're safe. The shed's holding strong." Anna nodded, her eyes bright with relief. "I knew it would." And in that moment the storm seemed a little less fierce. the weight of the winter's burden a little lighter. They had made it through, not because of the speed with which they built or the amount of supplies they gathered, but because of their quiet perseverance, their steady faith in the work they had put in. Together, they had built something that would stand through the worst, and they would see it through to the end. Weeks passed, and the storm began to lose its strength. Though the snow piled high in places, the winds no longer howled with the same fury. The days stretched longer, and the nights, though still cold, began to soften just a little. Amos had spent much of the time tending to the fire, adding wood to the stove, checking the walls and the roof of the shed. Every crack was sealed, every corner reinforced. Despite the cold, the family remained warm, and the work that had once seemed unnecessary now seemed like a lifeline. Amos stood one morning by the window looking out over the farm. The wind had died down, and there was a quiet stillness in the air. For the first time in weeks, the sun peeked through the clouds, casting a pale light over the snowy landscape. The birds were returning, flitting across the bare branches of the trees. And although the world was still in the grip of winter, Amos could sense the shift, the promise of something new. The storm had been a trial, but now the end was in sight. He had seen the worst of the winter, had felt its bite deep into his bones, but in the face of it all, his family had remained safe. The shed, his steadfast creation, had shielded them from the cold and the winds, offering them a place of refuge when the world outside had seemed relentless. The simple act of building, of taking his time, of not rushing, had paid off. Anna joined him at the window, her hands folded over her chest, as she, too, took in the view. "It's finally starting to feel like spring," she said softly, her voice tinged with quiet relief. Amos nodded. "It's coming, slowly but surely." He watched as the snow began to melt, the first signs of life returning to the ground beneath. Though the cold had tested their endurance, it had also revealed something deeper, the importance of preparation, of patience, and of trusting in the work that was done, no matter how small or quiet it seemed at the time. As the days grew warmer, Amos and Anna began to prepare the land for the next season, readying the soil and gathering what was left of the firewood. The shed, once a sanctuary from the storm, was now a symbol of their perseverance, a reminder of what they had endured together and what they had accomplished. And when the first green shoots of spring broke through the soil, Amos knew that his quiet victory would last. They had made it through the winter, not just by surviving the elements, but by learning to trust in the quiet, steady work that had always been the foundation of their faith and their lives. As spring slowly began to push through the remnants of winter, life on the farm began to stir again. The snow that had once blanketed the land was now retreating, leaving behind patches of wet earth and the promise of new life. But while the world around him transformed, Amos couldn't shake the feeling that something else was changing within him. The storm, though it had passed, had revealed a deeper truth, a truth about patience, preparation, and the quiet strength of faith. In the days that followed the end of the storm, Amos made his rounds, checking the fields, clearing the paths, and repairing the fences that had been damaged by the weight of the snow. There was much work to be done, and yet, even as he labored, there was a sense of peace in the air. For the first time in months, the land felt safe again. The worst had passed. One afternoon, as Amos was walking along the path toward the barn's remains, a figure appeared in the distance. It was a man, a stranger, dressed in the familiar plain attire of a neighbor from a nearby community. Amos could tell by the man's steady gait and the way he carried himself that he was no stranger to hard work, though his face was weathered, a bit older than Amos. As the man drew nearer, Amos greeted him with a nod. "Morning, neighbor," he called out. "I wasn't expecting anyone today. Can I help you with something?" The man smiled, but there was a sadness in his eyes. "I heard about the storm and the barn," he said, coming to a stop in front of Amos. I've seen what happened to your place. My name is Daniel Fisher from over by Willow Creek. My family and I heard how you built that shed of yours, the one that survived the coldest winter we've known. We thought you might need a hand." Amos blinked in surprise, unsure how to respond. "We're fine," he said, his voice soft. "We've made it through thanks to the shed and the patience we've had. There's no need for anyone to worry about us." Daniel shook his head. "It's not about worry, it's about community. We heard you took the time to build something right when everyone else was in a rush to rebuild. I know how hard it is to take time when the world is telling you to hurry, but I can see now it was the right choice." Amos was silent for a moment. He had built the shed with his own hands, guided by the quiet faith that it would see them through. But to hear someone from outside recognize the value of that decision meant more than words could express. There was a deep satisfaction in knowing that, despite the isolation of their farm and the pressures of others, his family had made it through, and now there was a chance to offer help in return. "I'd be grateful for any help you can offer, Daniel," Amos said, extending a hand. "I've got wood to gather, and there's always work to be done with the fields." Daniel smiled, clasping Amos's hand firmly. "We're neighbors now, Amos. You helped your own, and it's time we helped you. Together, we'll see this place back to where it should be." With that, the two men set to work. Over the following days, Daniel and his family joined Amos and his, working side by side. The task seemed lighter with each passing day, not just because of the extra hands, but because of the sense of shared purpose. The shed, still standing strong, had become a symbol of the strength of community, how a single act of quiet perseverance could ripple out to touch the lives of others. As the sun began to sink low in the sky on the fifth evening of Daniel's help, Amos stood at the edge of his land, watching the glow of the fire from the shed. He saw his children playing near the firelight, their laughter filling the air, and his heart swelled with gratitude. The world outside had tested him, his faith, his ability to endure. But here, in this small corner of Lancaster, he knew that survival wasn't just about one person or one family. It was about the strength that came when people worked together, when they helped one another, and when they trusted that no one had to face life's storms alone. Months passed, and the season turned once again. The winds of spring softened into summer, and the snow, once a harsh and unforgiving blanket, was now a memory of challenges overcome. The land was alive again, the fields stretching green and fertile beneath the bright sky. The corn had sprouted, the potatoes were strong, and the fruit trees were beginning to blossom. Amos and his family worked hard, of course, but there was a new rhythm to their labor, a sense of calm and confidence that had been born from their experiences that harsh winter. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, Amos sat on the front porch of the shed, his hands resting on his knees. The warmth of the day still lingered in the air, and the distant sounds of birds and insects created a peaceful harmony. He could see Anna working in the garden, her hands moving through the earth with the same care she had shown when they first planted their seeds. The children were nearby, chasing each other through the yard, laughing with abandon. For the first time in many months, Amos allowed himself to simply be present in the moment, to feel the satisfaction of what they had achieved. He had weathered the storm not only in terms of the weather, but also in the larger struggles of life, against doubt, against the pressure to conform, and against the temptation to rush through decisions. He had trusted his instincts, his hands, and his faith. Anna walked over to him, a basket of herbs in hand. She sat beside him, her face bathed in the soft light of the evening. "We made it through, Amos," she said softly, a smile playing on her lips. "Not just the storm, but everything. I feel it too, the peace, the quiet, knowing that we've done what was needed." Amos nodded, his heart full of quiet pride. "It wasn't just me, Anna. It was you, and it was the help of others. The work we've done together has made this moment possible." Anna smiled, her eyes warm with understanding. "You showed us all that it's not always the fast way that leads to the right place, Amos. It's the steady, the careful, and the patient way. Amos took her hand, his voice a soft whisper. I think we've learned the value of patience, of trust, and of community. And that's worth more than any barn, any harvest, or any shelter. The evening stretched on, the stars beginning to appear in the sky. The fireflies danced in the warm air, and for a brief moment Amos felt as though time itself had slowed to match the steady beat of his own heart. Together they had endured the hardest season of their lives. And together they had built something far greater than any structure. They had built a life, and in that life they had discovered what it meant to truly survive. It was early autumn when the next test came, though this one was not from the cold or the blizzards. Instead, it arrived in the form of a letter, a piece of paper with words written on it that held more weight than any storm Amos had ever faced. He found the letter one morning tucked under the door of their small home just after he had finished feeding the livestock. The paper was thin and yellowed with age, bearing the stamp of the county courthouse. Amos held it carefully in his hands, unsure of what to expect. The address was for him, but the words inside were more cryptic than he had hoped for. With a quiet sigh, Amos unfolded the paper and began to read. Dear Mr. Byler, it has come to our attention that your property lies within the area slated for purchase by the town. As part of the development project to build a road through the valley, your land is among those targeted for sale to make room for the expansion of the local infrastructure. The terms of compensation are outlined below. The letter went on to explain the town's plans for new roads and the land they needed to acquire to complete the project. Amos's eyes skimmed the numbers, the figures that seemed so insignificant next to the value of his land, his home, and the life he had built. The town offered him a fair sum, they claimed, but Amos felt a sense of loss, an ache deep inside him. This land was not just property, it was a foundation of his family's history, the soil where his ancestors had worked, where his own children had played. To lose it would be to lose a part of himself. The townspeople, the very ones who had questioned his slow, careful ways during the winter, were now pushing to take what he had worked for, and in doing so, taking away his peace. Amos stood by the window, staring out at the land that had become his sanctuary. The fields were now golden with the ripening harvest, and the shed, sturdy as ever, stood proudly in the distance. He could hear the sound of the children laughing as they ran along the path leading to the orchard, their voices carried on the wind. He had always trusted in the land, in the quiet rhythm of the seasons. But now the rhythm was disturbed. The town's plans threatened everything that had made their life here worthwhile. Anna joined him at the window, sensing the weight of the moment without Amos needing to speak. She rested a hand on his arm, her touch a quiet comfort. "We'll do what we must, Amos," she said softly, her voice steady, though her eyes betrayed the sadness she felt for their family. "But remember, no one can take away what we've built. The storm is passing. It's the calm that follows that will define us." Amos looked at her, the warmth of her words settling his heart. It wasn't about the land, it was about the life they had created there. And, no matter what happened, that was something that no one could take from them. In the days that followed, Amos worked hard, as he always did. He visited the town hall, met with the representatives, and listened carefully to what they had to say. They spoke of progress and modernization, of a future that promised to bring new opportunities to the valley. But Amos knew better than to believe that such words always came with good intentions. Beneath their talk of expansion lay a reality that wasn't as welcoming, a reality that threatened to uproot the quiet life he had fought so hard to build. After several meetings, Amos knew that the offer was more than just a proposal, it was a reality he would have to face. His land would be sold, and his family would need to move, but rather than retreating into anger or frustration, Amos decided to take a different path. He called a meeting with his neighbors, the very ones who had once mocked him for his cautious ways. He invited them to the shed, the place that had once symbolized the culmination of his faith and hard work. As they gathered inside, Amos looked around at the faces of those who had doubted him, who had questioned his decisions. Some looked uncomfortable, others curious. Amos stood before them, his back to the fire that crackled in the hearth. "I know many of you thought I was foolish," he began, his voice calm but firm. "You saw me building slowly, carefully, when the others rushed to finish. You saw my work and thought I was wasting time, wasting money. But now I'm standing here to ask you this. What is it that we're building for? Is it just to get through the year, or are we building something that will endure, something that will last, no matter what comes our way?" The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Amos looked at each person in turn, his eyes steady, his heart resolute. "The land is being taken from us, and we cannot stop it. But what we can do is ensure that no matter where we go, no matter where we are, we keep building what matters most, the bonds of community, the strength of our faith, and the quiet perseverance that has always carried us through." His words hung in the air, as if the very walls of the shed absorbed them. The men and women around him stood still, each one contemplating the truth in Amos's voice. Anna stepped forward then, her hand gently resting on Amos's arm. "It's not the land that defines us," she said softly, "but what we do with it, how we nurture it, and how we use it to love and care for one another." Slowly, one by one, the neighbors nodded. The tension in the room eased, replaced by a sense of solidarity, a quiet understanding that perhaps Amos's way, his patience, his faith, was not so foolish after all. The next morning, after the meeting had ended, Amos made his way back to the shed. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden light over the land. Though he knew the road ahead would not be easy, he also knew that it would be a journey marked by resilience, by the unwavering trust in what they had built together. With a deep breath, Amos stood tall in the morning light, ready to face whatever came next. And in that moment he realized that no matter where life took them, they would always carry with them the quiet strength of a life well lived, a life built on patience, faith, and the bonds of a community that had weathered every storm together. The journey was far from over, but as the sun rose higher, Amos knew that the best of the dawn had already arrived.